I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Coaching Questions Show on the Coaching Conversations podcast with Jim Knight. This show is for everyone that calls the Instructional Coaching Group home for all your instructional coaching content. These episodes are designed for everyone who desires to think and learn alongside Jim as you continue to make an impact with all the great work you do. I'm Jessica Wise, a consultant with the Instructional Coaching Group. Today's Coaching Questions episode is part 2 of the story of instructional coaching. In the last Coaching Questions podcast, we began our 2-part look into the story of instructional coaching. In part 1, we explored Jim's early career, how curiosity about serving teachers and reaching students took Jim and many team members down a road that produced the partnership approach. In part 2, we continue moving through the timeline that brought us research such as the definition of instructional coaching and the impact cycle. Once our Q&A has come to a close, we'll have an epilogue, or a final note at the end of the show where I ask Jim 2 questions to wrap up our discussion before we sign off. So, on with the show. Hi, Jim.
Good to see you, Jessica. How are you doing?
Great to see you. I see we match again today.
That's good. Graduation for you tomorrow. You're walking down the hill.
Yes.
To get your PhD official deal.
It'll be official. It's very exciting. My kids are excited too.
It is kind of a cool thing for your kids to see. It is really cool. Congratulations. It's great.
Thank you so much. You know, I was laughing, Jim, because the last time we recorded, you had severe weather, or you had the alert. Today, I have severe weather. There's a tornado watch all over North Georgia. My kids were terrified to go to school. So we're just keeping everyone on their toes as they listen.
That's the way it is. It is, unfortunately, that's the way it is. This year especially, it seems.
Yes, I think so. Well, welcome, everyone. And we're so excited you decided to tune back in for part 2. So, Jim, last time we ended with a turning point in your learning and research that prompted you and your team to think deeply about working one-on-one with teachers and how that is a very effective approach to professional development. And this is where the term instructional coaching actually came about. So I thought we'd start with this term, instructional coaching, and how it evolved from your work and research.
Well, you know, we did a lot of studies, and we did formal and kind of informal studies. When I started out, we were just kind of gathering informal data. We're trying it out. We didn't really know what we were doing at all. We were just like, we got to get in there and do something. Nobody else had done this before that we knew of. So we were just trying to figure it out. What would support look like? I remember sitting in a meeting with people from the University of Kansas, not my colleagues at the center, but others. And they said, there's no way anybody's ever going to do this. Why would they ever do this? This is crazy. They can't fund this. And I'm like, well, I can't think of a better way to do it. So I'm going to keep studying this regardless. And so we kind of stuck with it. And then, from about 1996 to 1999, we had a study called Strategic Advantage, where we worked with technology teachers to make the classes more inclusive. I talked a bit about that before. We were just getting started. And we got quite a bit of funding for Gear Up with Topeka School District. And so we had coaches in every middle school, initially just 3 of the middle schools, and ultimately all the middle schools and all the high schools. And we got other funding too, state and school improvement grants and other things. And we would meet every Friday at the library in Topeka, and we would walk through the after action review questions. What was supposed to happen? What really happened? What accounts for the difference? What do we do differently next time? And we just kept refining our model week by week, interaction by interaction. And we learned so much, and I was embedded in the district. I was working with principals. Sometimes I was working with teachers, coaching. Sometimes I was modeling practices. It was really what sometimes is called participant observer kind of research. We were in there building sense. And then when the book Instructional Coaching came out, really our orientation at that point, and this is why I'm doing a second edition of it now. That's what I'm working on this week. Our orientation was it's about helping people learn teaching practices. And so I worked at the Center for Research on Learning. They've done a lot of research on inclusive teaching practices, on direct instruction around learning processes, helping kids learn how to learn through direct instruction, or sometimes called explicit instruction. And so we were trying to get people to use those practices. We would go in there, and the coaches were trying to encourage people to use them. And we found in one study that I presented at ARA in San Diego in, I think, 2009, along with a fellow named Jake Burnett, we found that when people had coaching, they were more likely to implement. And it was like from 33% of any evidence of implementation to something like 80%. And then the quality of implementation was on a scale of 1 to 10. It was, or I guess 1 to 7. It was like 2 without coaching, and it was much higher than that with coaching. I forget what the exact numbers were. It might have been a scale of 1 to 10. But anyway, there was no doubt that coaching improved practices. But what troubled us was that the people didn't sustain their use. They didn't implement. And so then we had funding to do a project with Beaverton, Oregon, the home of Nike. And that's how I met Michelle Harris. She was a part of the team of coaches I work with. This has been about 2008, 2009. And there we started to evolve our thinking about goal setting. Really, Michelle deserves credit because she said, we really need to do goals. And she had training in SMART goals. So we tried out SMART goals. SMART goals didn't particularly work very well. And I looked at the literature on goal setting, and I came up with the acronym PEERS goals. It took me 6 hours of playing around with acronym websites to come up with an acronym for it. And it wasn't about the acronym. It was about what we read in the literature on goal setting. And what we read in the literature on goal setting is it has to matter to you. It has to be emotionally compelling. You want to make it as easy as possible, but you also want it to be really powerful. The best goals are pretty easy to get to, but they're really powerful in terms of their impact. When you look at the technology that's embraced, and there's an author named Csikszentmihalyi who wrote a book called The Evolving Self, and he said, technology people embrace is always easier or more powerful. And so we're striving for those two things in our goal setting. But what we really learned along the way was focusing on the strategy was the wrong place. You need to focus on the teacher. And so we said those goals have to be student-focused goals. Powerful, emotionally compelling, easy, reachable, which is the smart stuff about having a goal you're striving for and you can identify a strategy to get there. And then student-focused. And the student-focused part was critical because with the student-focused part, then you had an objective standard for excellence. You don't have the student-focused goal. It's just like try the strategy. What we found is people would like it. They'd try it once or twice, but they wouldn't stick with it. But once we set up the student-focused goal, then they ran with it, and then they started to do it. The other thing is, and I learned this in part from the research on change, in particular Prochaska's research on change in the book Changing for Good that summarizes more than a decade of research on change. He said the first stage of change is pre-contemplation. We found exactly the same thing. And my colleague at the University of Kansas, Mike Hoke, found that when you use video and you help people use video, then they start to see their practices and then they change their practices. And so we realized we had to help teachers get a clear picture of reality as a starting point for coaching, in part because of Prochaska's research and also because of what we knew. That people have been studying the power of video since the 70s, big studies done in Stanford and so forth. So around 2014, I put out the book called Focus on Teaching, which is about the power of video. Now, this is a long answer to your question, but the definition we've arrived at is a result of all those various studies. I presented our results at ARA in 2009. The partnership one was 1999. We subsequently done other studies we'll probably talk about, but the definition became something like this. An instructional coach partners. So the partner is based on the partnership principles, study I did in 1999. Partners with teachers to identify a clear picture of current reality. Well, that had a lot to do with Mike's research on using video and what we found about using video. And so they partner with teachers to get a clear picture of reality. Prochaska says people don't have a clear picture of reality, but video helps you get a clear picture of reality. And then to identify teaching practices. And over time, we learned that you need to be really precise and clear. I ended up, luckily enough, to be able to work with Atul Gawande, who wrote the Checklist Manifesto. And Atul's work really validated what we were finding in our work in Topeka and then in Beaverton, that we have to have clear explanations of the strategy. They have checklists that we share. We share them in a dialogical way, but nonetheless, we have to be really clear ourselves and explain it. So next part of the definition is we help people identify and learn teaching practices and then make adaptations. Influence there was a fellow named Ron Heifetz, who says that real complex change requires adaptive responses. Trying to come up with a simple solution to a challenging situation is, he said, the biggest mistake leaders can make. In fact, he says it's something like when you apply a recipe to something as complex as teaching, it's actually going to make things worse and not better. So Heifetz really shaped us as we started to think about the adapt part. So the definition is instructional coaches partner with teachers to get a clear picture of current reality, to identify and explain teaching practices that sometimes involve modeling. And we learned through our process, there's a lot of different ways you can do modeling. You could watch a video, you could go watch another teacher, you could co-teach, I could go in and model. But learn teaching practice and then make adaptations until the goal gets hit. And that all grew over time. And even the cycle, the impact cycle, which we'll probably talk about in this, it dramatically changed over about 5 or 6 years as we kept trying to get better and better at what we were doing.
Well, thank you, Jim. So a few things that stood out to me from what you said. First, I really appreciate that you and your research team or your partners, you shared at the beginning, you weren't quite sure what you were doing. And I, as a new coach, that's where I was. So I feel very validated knowing that we all started in the same place. We're not sure what we're doing, but we're just going to keep doing it. You had this relentless desire to keep doing what you knew would result in better lives and well-being for kids. But I think it made me feel seen. You're like, well, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. Keep doing it. Whew, that's where we were. So coaches out there, if you're not sure what you're doing, keep doing it. You'll get there. And then, Jim, another thing was, go ahead.
I'll just say, if you're not sure what you're doing, take the virtual institute.
Yeah, come to our course.
That's right.
Join us online.
But I would say what happened was we had these coaches. It was funded by Gear Up, had them in the different schools. And we were really excited about the fact that follow-up was better than nothing. And so people were implementing some things, and there was more interest. It's just that they weren't sustaining their implementation. But it was a lot better than nothing. Like workshops were not anywhere near as effective as this. And we're presenting our experiences and what we were finding. And my colleague, Mike Hoke, the one who got me thinking about the power of video, he's now the director of the Center for Research on Learning at the University of Kansas, said, it'd be really helpful if we had sort of a way to do this. And we could just lay out step by step what the way is. And I said, well, that's a good idea. And then we started to really systematically study it and try to say, what's working, what's not working. And it kind of emerged from our work, this model with, I probably spent the better part of a decade in the Topeka School District, day by day, working with coaches, refining and improving what we're doing almost every day. And that's kind of where it came from.
That's wonderful. So you shared the definition of instructional coaching is coaches partner with teachers. They establish current reality. They get really clear on the teaching strategy. And then you keep working, you make improvements and make adaptations until that goal is met and until we see an improvement with kids. And I can't help but think of early in my career, Jim, when I thought I was coaching, but really I was just walking up and down hallways telling people what to do. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, that's not how you coach. So maybe I should back off a little and just ask questions and be there to listen and then say, yeah, you should go give that a try. I feel like the directive and facilitative approaches I was taking was never really this middle ground of what you're describing as instructional coaching. So my question, Jim, is how do you support people in really understanding instructional coaching and maybe clearing up the misconceptions about what that is?
Well, the first thing I would say is the partnership approach, the dialogical approach. First off, it was my dissertation. So I read widely, and you'll know all about this since you're graduating this week. But I read really widely on the literature around how people learn ideas from each other. Everything from cultural anthropology, which is where I would put Rianne Eisler's work on partnership approach, to R.J. Bernstein about essentially the philosophy of science and what we know about knowledge there. And then people like William Isaacs and Bohm, Peter Senge, Paulo Freire, all these different people that talked about how you interact with other people to help them learn. And we landed on this idea of the partnership principles. And then the study we did 2 different workshops. And one workshop was a directive way, and one workshop was the partnership way. You can download the article I presented at ARA a long time ago. But we found that when you took the partnership approach, teachers were 4.5 more likely to embrace what they learned, 59 to 13. than if we didn't take the partnership approach. So what that looks like in real life is I see the other person as a professional. I mean, what makes a professional? It's your capacity to think for yourself, to use your professional discretion. Going to see a doctor shouldn't be like going through the drive-thru at McDonald's where you read a skip. You want the doctor to look at you and look at your particular situation, use their brain to adaptively respond to your unique situation. And it's the same thing with teachers. We don't want teachers just to do exactly the same thing for every student. Take, for example, the concept of cold calling, where you call on kids whether they're ready or not. Well, that might work for some kids, but what if the kid's neurodiverse and they have long processing time and they come to class terrified that they're going to get called every day? It doesn't work for every student. And so cold calling might work really well with one group of students. It might really work well with some groups within your class, but it might not work for everybody. And so you have to be careful to make what happens in the classroom fit what's happening. And so by taking the partnership approach, we were able to embody what Eric Liu says. It's not one size fits all, it's one size fits one. We were able to work with the teacher and figure out by setting first off a goal about what will be the change we want to see, the difference in students, and then working it out with the teacher. So the problem with the directive approach, and there are times when the directive approach is the right thing to do, especially if you're an administrator. If you're shaping a kind of culture, sometimes you have to be really clear. This is not going to fly in this school. We need a team that works together, and right now you're not being helpful or someone's being unprofessional or whatever. But assuming the person we're working with is professional, the directive approach, I call it coach-splaining. It's like mansplaining, but coach-splaining. It puts the emphasis on the wrong thing. It's usually on the strategy. It likely is going to decrease the likelihood that the other person is going to learn from the experience. It decreases their ownership because you're solving the problem and they're not solving the problem. Now, the thing about a dialogical approach is you can accomplish the same things you would do with the directive approach. You can share your ideas. You just share them in a way that makes it more likely they'll embrace them. So instead of saying, hey, I looked at your class, you should do this, you say, do you mind if I share some thoughts and you tell me what you think? Because if you say, hey, I looked at your class, you should do this, it's a good chance it'll engender some resistance. That old saying, when you insist, they will resist, is very true. But if you offer it as an option, then what you're doing is you're asking to be invited into their decision-making process so they can tell you what they're thinking about it, because we're really good at nodding our head yes and doing nothing. So the dialogical approach, you're not holding back on sharing what you think. You just share it in a way that significantly increases the likelihood that people will embrace what you say. And I probably said this last time too, but the reality of it is people only do what they choose to do. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. Unless I choose to do it, it's not happening. I mean, choice is implicit. It's a part of every interaction with the person. People can nod their head yes and do nothing, or they can actually do the change. So I would like them to feel safe saying to me, well, I don't think I want to do it that way. I want to do it this way. Or what about this? Where we have a real conversation instead of me being up here talking down to you and telling you what to do. And besides which, that up, down, when I'm one up and you're one down, almost always engenders resistance. That's what Edgar Schein says in all his books about helping. So it's kind of a rambling long answer, but the dialogical approach grounded in the partnership principles. We have evidence to support it based on the research I did. But the other part of it is, it's not about silencing yourself. It's not a dialogue if I'm not saying what I think. It's just saying what I think in a way that's going to be more likely to land. Telling the person what to do, way less likely. Plus the assumption that I know what's best based on a 45-minute observation of your class, it's arrogant. I really think if there's one thing I've learned about coaching is teaching makes you humble. It's easy to look at the class and from the outside figure, I know what they really have to do. But you get in there and start teaching the class, modeling the classroom. Oh, this is not quite as easy as I want. So to me, every time I interact with a teacher, I've learned that the honest answer is, I'm not 100% sure if this will work, but here's an idea. What do you think about it? What I am sure of is if we work together, we will hit that goal. Your students will learn more or they'll be more engaged. I can guarantee we'll do that. we'll have to keep working on it. But this particular strategy, I'm not 100% sure, but this is what I'm thinking. We go back and forth. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I got pretty wound up about it anyway, Jessica. So
no, you got very passionate. It's passion. That's
right.
coming. And I appreciate the long answers because it really helps us see the story and the ideas behind it. Earlier, Jim, you started to talk about the process that coaches can use, which leads me to think about the amount of time and effort that you and your team and your research partners dedicated to studying instructional coaching. And all of these studies helped you to build, they helped you to refine, improve, and iterate the model that we now know as the impact cycle. And look, here it is on my bookshelf. I'm featuring another book from you right now.
I know, it was instructional coaching last time.
Yeah, so it's impact cycle. It's just going to keep changing every time we meet. So I wondered if you could...
Data rules will be coming up pretty soon.
Data rules, yes, that'll be next.
Well, I had the IC toolkit, so that's the one.
I've got many choices. I can rotate through that a little. So I wonder, Jim, if you could talk about how early studies and the lean design research helped you to create this process that we use as instructional coaches.
Right. So you can find the description of what we call lean design research. It was a model of research. It's kind of a hybrid of what we usually think of design thinking and a book called The Lean Startup. And the Lean Startup was really about software, about iterating and continuously improving, which is a big part of design. So what we did is we said, this is going to be our process for continuously improving and figuring out how to get better. So the way it works is you set a goal. So our goal was initially implementation, and then it became a change in students, either engagement or achievement. We knew what we were measuring, wanted to see if it worked, and then the coaches would try it out. And then they would have some success and some challenges. And then we would get together and we'd talk about the challenges. And we would say, well, what can we do? And so when we identified the challenges, I would look at the research, literature. Sometimes I would interview experts. And other times we would problem solve and kind of invent solutions to the challenges we're facing. And often it was a combination of those. So, for example, when we changed goal setting to peers goals, I read pretty widely in goal setting. So I looked at a lot of different articles and books to talk about how to set goals and realized that SMART misses some important things. Like, is the goal really going to have a powerful difference? Is it a student-focused goal? Is it an emotionally compelling goal? Now, SMART can mean all kinds of things, so you could weave that in there. But often what we found with SMART is everybody was just trying to get every letter in the acronym. And they're missing the important things. Is this going to make a difference for kids? And do I really care about it? And do I know how I'm going to get there? Do I have a pathway? That's what happened there. But when it came to questioning, what I did is we watched the video of the coaching conversations, and this mostly happened in Beaverton and then in Othello, Washington. It was the other place. And so the coaches and I got together in Kansas or out in Oregon. We watched the videos. We could see the questioning wasn't working. And it wasn't the coach's fault. They were doing what we asked them to do. So then I went and I interviewed as many experts on questioning as I could. So I talked to Steve Barkley, who's written a book about instructional coaching and questioning. Joellen Killian at that point, she was the Associate Director of Learning Forward. Kathy Toll, who to my mind was at that point the preeminent researcher or coaching expert on literacy coaching. Lucy West, who then was probably the preeminent researcher on math coaching. Bruce Wellman, who's a big expert on cognitive coaching. And I asked them all about questions, what questions they ask and how they went to a workshop with Susan Scott on questioning. And then we came up with a list of questions from those interviews, and then the coaches tried it out and we sort of filtered it and revised it. We had a pretty primitive way of doing it, but eventually that became the identify questions. And we knew we wanted to use video, and the coaches tried out the video, and then they would sit down with the teachers and they would talk about the video together. And we could just see in the videos it wasn't working. And so we said, maybe the thing to do is do it separately. We tried it separately, and the coaches figured that out. So sometimes it was experts, sometimes it was research, sometimes it was the coaches. But in creating the book, The Impact Cycle, we went through 11 iterations. First off in Beaverton, and then we had this funding to do research in Othello, Washington, and we kept the process going until we landed on a process that seemed pretty simple and powerful. And even the way we were doing it initially, I think it was refine and support instead of what we now call the improvement stage. We had different names for things and how the questions worked, and we kept trying it out, and the goal was to come up with a process that really worked. And from that lean design research, we landed on what eventually became the impact cycle.
11 iterations to get that impact cycle right. I think that's what gives me such faith in following the impact cycle. Is it's truly evidence-based. You and your team spent many years and many people worked on this project. So was there anything you'd like to say about the amount of time and energy that other people also poured into this?
Well, there are a lot of people. Dr. Marty Alford at the University of Kansas was a project director, and she's subsequently written a thing on virtual coaching, which I really recommend. And David Knight wrote the major article on looking at the impact of coaching. We found a 1.02 effect size, looking at the impact on the engagement of students. The coaches in both settings were magnificent to work with. I mean, it's really the coaches that did the hard work because they would try things out and do new things. Their deep commitment to succeeding was really, really important. And, along the way, we've published articles or published books. I think there are now 10 books out documenting what we did, and presented many of the findings at the American Educational Research Association, which means they went through peer review. And we made a lot of mistakes, and we learned from those mistakes. And we really, at least 50 people dedicated the bulk of their life for years on coming up with this model. And so it troubles me when new models come out that don't acknowledge the history that's gone by, that they don't say, oh, well, they learned this. So I see sometimes a new model of coaching will come out that it's like, that's where we were. Not, it sounds patronizing, but I don't mean it that way. But I mean the focus on a strategy versus the focus on students. That's where we started. When you read the Instructional Coaching book from 2007, that's what I describe in that book. In fact, I found a whole workbook describing the old way we used to do things. But we learned in a systematic way that there are better ways of doing these things, and I guess there's more than one path to the sort of shiny house of student achievement. There are a lot of different ways of getting there. But I think it's useful to look at what we've learned, not just here, but also in other kinds of coaching. We learned a lot from Steve Barclay's book on coaching, cognitive coaching, and proactive coaching. So the things that were existing back when we got started, they weren't instructional coaching, but they were helpful. And I think, I'd urge people who are thinking about coaching to become aware of what we've learned along the way so they can use that to be even better.
Well, thank you for all of that. And I think I'm one of those people who started out coaching without a focus on goals or a focus on students. It was the teaching strategy. It was, hey, it would work in your classroom, this, and here's how you do it. I didn't share it provisionally like a partner would. I shared it very much, here's how you do it. This is the way you should go and try it, and let me know what you think. So I wonder, Jim, if you could talk for just a moment. If coaches are out there and they really want to recalibrate their coaching and become more student-focused, what can they do?
Well, I think the 7 success factors that I talk about in the Definitive Guide to Instructional Coaching is a good starting point. And there's an article that was in Principal Leadership. I think it's called Teaching to Win for some reason. But it describes those 7 success factors. They function like a rubric. In fact, in evaluating instructional coaching, we have rubrics for what that looks like. So I think using those 7 success factors as kind of a guideline to your own professional learning. Do I know how to gather data so teachers can set goals and monitor progress until they hit the goals, data related to engagement and achievement? Do I have a set of teaching practices that I've identified that are high impact teaching practices? Do I have a coaching cycle that I can use that's efficient in terms of identifying student focused goals and keep making adaptations until we hit it? And then what's my way of interacting with people? Does it feel weird the way I interact? Does it feel like I'm putting people down? Does it feel really like a healthy relationship? When I first started out doing workshops back a long time ago, back in the days of the overhead, I felt it wasn't working. I could feel that I was talking down to people, and I didn't want to do that, but I felt, I know the research, I have to tell you what to do. And I could feel there was something out of sync with the way I was interacting. Once we looked deeply into the way people interact and we looked at the partnership principles, we realized you can work as an equal with the person and really move forward. So the principles that I'm working from? Do they enable healthy relationships? Do I listen effectively? Watch yourself on video. See, am I spending about 20% of the time talking and they're talking about 80%? And then am I using my time efficiently? Am I interacting in a way that's a multiplier? Am I balancing ambition with humility? And do I work in a system that supports me? So those 7 success factors it's hard to be successful without all 7 of those things working. Can't learn it all at once. Too bad we couldn't just like put a little drive into somebody's head and have them learn it all the way. It's not like the Matrix. People have to work it through, but having that framework, I think, is good. And to get started, I'd say just download a checklist for the impact cycle, and make sure you really understand the cycle. How am I going to get a clear picture of current reality? What questions am I going to ask to set a goal? Where am I going to find the strategies? Like, start with the cycle, to start with what you're going to do and work backwards. And there are, on the website, instructionalcoaching.com, there are tons of free blogs and articles and tools you can download to help you do that.
In the articles that you're naming too, they can find those as well, like Teach to Win. They can find One Size Fits One. So all of these great articles too capture many of the ideas you're sharing with us today. Okay, I have a final question for you, Jim.
Great.
It's about the approach that we've been talking about, and really that we started talking about in our first episode, dialogical coaching. You've written about 3 approaches to coaching, and this book right here behind me, in the Impact Cycle, and other works. And you have a video on the ICG YouTube page where people can explore, but let's address it right here. Why is a dialogical approach, one-on-one with teachers, an effective approach to coaching?
We never set out to say our approach is better than another one. What we set out to do is to find a really effective approach. And we said that there are different kinds of coaching. And so sometimes you're going to take a facilitative approach. Sometimes you're going to take a dialogical approach. Sometimes you'll take a directive approach. In the literature, the facilitative and directive approach are usually contrasted. So Gary Bloom, for example, in his book Blended Coaching, talks about those two. Alina Aguilar talks about those two. Gary's idea is you have to pick and choose your approach, and I kind of agree with what he has to say there. But the facilitative approach, that's what would be like cognitive coaching would be there. Growth coaching, which, we do workshops on growth coaching. You and I both lead the Introduction to Leadership Coaching, which is about that. And coactive coaching is another approach that would be facilitative. And that and many of the things with the International Coaching Federation, when you take a facilitative approach, you usually don't share your ideas. What you're facilitating is the thinking of the other person. And I've had many different coaches. I almost always have some kind of coach in some capacity. And facilitative coaching is really helpful when you know the knowledge you need. You just haven't figured out how to do it. So if I said, I've got 10 things to do and I've got enough time for 5 of them, what am I going to do? If I had a facilitative coach, they might be able to ask me questions, think things through, set priorities, make plans. And it's really, really helpful to have a facilitative approach. They ask questions that invite you to think deeper and to see more. The directive approach is where I'm going to explain how to do things in certain ways. I'm going to tell you what to do. Now, to my mind, most of the things that happen in the directive approach are probably more effectively done in the dialogical approach. But sometimes, particularly if the coach is an administrator, some things have to stop. And you have to explain it. Other times, what you're explaining is really simple. Christian Van Nieuwerburgh has this joke, which I love. He says, if somebody shows up to you and says, can you tell me how to find City Hall? They don't want you to say, other times we tried to find City Hall, what's work? Like they want you to tell you how to do it. If I'm trying to learn how to use Otter, the artificial intelligence thing, which we're messing around with today, it'd be helpful if somebody could tell me what to do. So sometimes just telling the person when it's really simple, why wouldn't you just tell them? That's all they want to know. But if you're telling something to somebody that they aren't really receptive to, they're not really open to, and if you're coming up with a recipe to a complex thing like the classroom, the directive approach probably isn't going to work. And the directive approach also stunts the learning of the other person because you're doing the learning. You're just telling them what to do. And I always say coaching's about now and not yet. When you take the directive approach, you sometimes inhibit the growth of the person because you're solving the problem. They're not solving it. So the third approach is the dialogical approach. And the dialogical approach is where you still share your thinking when it's useful, but you don't necessarily start with your ideas. I love Michael Bungay-Stanier's question, probably my favorite coaching question. You've probably thought a lot about this. What do you think you might do? You ask that question, and then you say, and what else? And often they'll tell you just what you really wanted to tell the person. And the problem is our brains are wired to want to tell people what to do. We get pleasure from telling people what to do. It's a dopamine hit, like a kid playing a video game. It feels good, but it doesn't really help the person because it inhibits their growth, and it often engenders resistance. Edgar Schein talked about this. Miller and Rowland talked about this. DC and Ryan talked about this. Dan Pink summarizes it in his book. And many other people Edgar Schein, many other people have talked about the fact that telling people what to do is not an effective way to affect change. Helpful when things have to be said. What you're doing, you're bullying kids, it has to stop. Helpful when you have a simple thing to explain. But when you're addressing something that's complex, to partner with the person, to think together with them and engage in dialogue is much more effective in our experience.
Well, thank you for breaking that down. And also, if people want to learn more about the dialogical approach, they can come to our institutes or our workshops or reach out and we can support them. So that's another way too.
Right.
Jim, thank you so much for all of the information that you've shared with us. And we're telling over 2 episodes now the story of instructional coaching. It's been such an honor to hear it. And I feel very honored that you've allowed me to be a part of this story. So I just wanted to say thank you very much.
You're a bigger and bigger part all the time, Jessica. Your book, IC Toolkit, I can't wait to see it. It's going to be wonderful.
Great. Yes. Come to TLC. Be the first one to grab it, everyone.
Right.
All right. Well, we've reached our epilogue, Jim. And last time we shook it up, so I'm going to do something a little bit different today, too. I thought we could address some misconceptions. You already started to do this, but I thought let's give an opportunity for you to address 2 big ones about the approaches to coaching. So first is that instructional coaches, experienced educators who are familiar with effective teaching practices, should just tell the teacher what to do. So teachers who don't know, they just need to be told. Coaches should be directive instead of dialogical, and that's a misconception. So Jim, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, well, I think if it works, my answer to everything is if it works, do it. But what we found, and that's where we started, we would show up and tell people what to do. My first workshops were all about research has been done. This is what you need to do. But the research wasn't done with the teacher's students. And what might work in a clinical study doesn't always necessarily work when you've got a really diverse group of students. So we found that it makes more sense to do it together, to think it through, and to start by asking the person what they think. It's surprising how often teachers will say exactly what you were thinking, or maybe have a better idea. And so beginning with the teacher and having the whole process driven by a goal rather than a strategy, a student-focused goal, is really critical, because then if you focus on the strategy, the teacher can implement it a few times and say, well, there I hit the goal, I did the strategy, now I'm going to go back to the way I teach. But if you set a student-focused goal, you have to stick with it. And the student-focused goal is your objective measure of the strategy, how effective it is. And when you have a teacher who wants to work on a strategy, my question usually is, well, how will we know it works? Do you want to know if it's working or not? Then you can work on that.
And you also help us to ask, what difference will it make for kids?
Right. That should be the starting point of the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Because our teachers do want to do what's right for kids. And if we just ask them to, this is the teaching strategy, master it as is, we're forgetting what you've said about adaptive research from Heifetz and others about that. It's not going to be the same with every group of kids every year. So let's get really good about watching the students to see what they think.
Right. I think that's the deal. And I think putting the focus on students actually makes the conversation work a little bit better. And it makes it stops it from just being talking about practices or I'm going to try it out. It's like, I have to implement it effectively in order to hit the student-focused goal.
That's right. Well, the second misconception, Jim, that I thought we would address is that instructional coaching, as you have defined it, is a facilitative approach to coaching. So will you help our listeners get really clear on what separates your approach from a facilitative approach?
Yeah, well, I think if somebody says it's facilitative, it's wrong. It's incorrect. We've never said that, and we've never described it that way. If anything, we probably lean more towards directive. You could maybe criticize it for that, but we don't see it that way. As I said, the facilitative approach is when you don't share ideas. And the dialogical approach is you share ideas, but you honor the capacity of the other person to think. So you don't show up and say, here's what I think you should do. You say, what do you think you should do? And as John Campbell says, a less than perfect goal chosen by the teacher is better than the perfect goal chosen by the coach. Now, if the teacher says something that's not going to work and you're pretty convinced it's wrong-headed, then I would say, do you mind if I share some thoughts I've got about this because I'm concerned or I think about this? But the moment you start to try to talk the person into your thing, the moment the conversation becomes less effective. That's what we found. I had an experience with a friend of mine, professor at university in Kansas, and he said, no, I haven't. Can we have breakfast? He said. And I said, well, it's great. Let's have breakfast. So we got together for breakfast. He said, I got these students. They're not really engaged. Have you got any ideas about how I engage them? So I thought, how lucky for him. Here I am, this expert on teaching. I've written courses on coaching for engagement. I've got a book called High Impact Instruction. I'll just give him a whole bunch of gems, and I just rattled off one thing after the other. And I felt really good. Look at me with all these solutions. But by the end of it, he felt diminished. And I don't think he never called me back to meet again. He never gave me any follow-up. He never said, let's have breakfast and talk about how great your ideas were. I don't think he did anything because I didn't involve him in the conversation. And the dialogical approach is involving the person. And you still share your ideas, but you share them with the recognition that nobody's going to do anything unless they choose to do it. And so you start with that understanding of how people work together. So I don't know if I've flogged this to death, but the facilitative approach, you don't share ideas. The dialogical approach, you share ideas in the most effective way, which is as a partner.
And we position teachers as professionals. I think that's a profound statement that has stuck with me from learning from you and with you over many years, is that we position them as professionals.
Yeah, and I got criticized for putting it that way, although I've said it that way many times. They said it's not really about positioning the teachers, it's actually seeing the teachers as professionals. And so I think you're quoting me, but I'm revising my quote. I think it is true. It's truly seeing the teacher as a professional. And people will say, what, this brand new teacher? What do they know? Well, they know some things. And when you study people who are the smartest people in the world, they'll tell you, there's a book called Never Stop Learning that documents this. They'll tell you that they expect to learn from every person they meet. I think that's a good stance for a coach too.
And it speaks to reciprocity, one of your partnership.
Right.
Well, Jim, I'm curious, is there anything we didn't talk about over these last 2 episodes that you would like to share with our listeners today?
Well, I think what we said last time, I would just reiterate that this is not my opinion and that we've tried things out. We've developed models for research. We've done qualitative studies on workshops. We've done quantitative studies using multiple baseline design and counterbalance design. Those presentations have sometimes worked their way into journals. Sometimes they've been presented at the American Education Research Association. But it's not about the individual studies. It's a life's work trying to get effective at this based on what we learn about coaching. I'm still learning today. Just yesterday, I talked to somebody, or maybe it was Friday anyway, in the last couple of days. And I thought, I've got to rethink the way in which they sit down and discuss watch your students, watch yourself form. I think we can do that more effectively. And I'm learning every day as I work. Right now, I'm specifically working with 5 coaches, getting feedback on how the process is working and how we can keep it getting even better. But the learning doesn't stop. And that's what we've been doing for a few decades. We've been trying to get better and better at coaching as we can move forward.
All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much. Again, I appreciate the opportunity that you gave me to talk to you about this story. This is almost 30 years of your work. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity.
Thank you, Jessica. It's hard to summarize 30 years in 30 minutes. It's really tough to summarize. And I think when you're right in the thick of it, there are so many complications. So I hope it hasn't been too rambling for our audience, but it matters pretty deeply to me that we do what we can to make a difference in kids' lives. And, we're all doing the same thing. We're all trying to do the best we can for kids. And that's just all we've been trying to do.
Well, thanks for all that you do, Jim. And thanks to all the people who've also contributed to this work. All right. If you found today's episode helpful, it would help us if you liked or followed the podcast. You can leave us a rating or a comment so we can continue to create meaningful content just for you. Thank you. And until next time, go forth and lead great coaching conversations.